folks there. So anyway, hi, my name is Mike. I have been teaching Drupal for quite a long time. I'm a consultant and a trainer, and I'm a firm believer that it's really difficult to be a trainer without actually doing it for real. So I'm an active developer. I was actually just working on a custom views plugin before this session. So I, like most people who have been around Drupal for a long time, when Drupal 8 first came out, was a little bit hesitant about using Composer. And it was like, do I really need to use Composer? I can still download modules and stick them in the right place. But over time, as I got more involved in core development, specifically around the Migrate initiative for Drupal 8, I saw the value in Composer as a core developer, but I didn't really see the value as a site builder or as a project builder. That's all changed now. Now I understand why Composer is so important, and I understand why it's an indispensable tool. And I hope to allow everybody to, I'm just looking at the chat. So, hey, look at that. Some people shared their screens. Hey, how's it going? Okay. So the first part of this presentation, I want to basically convince everybody that Composer is a good thing. So first of all, if you're interested in getting a copy of the slides, there you go. So I will go ahead and put this link in the chat right now. And this is all going on the assumption that there's something good in these slides. So you're gonna have to trust me for now. But let's talk about what is a dependency manager? Why do we need Composer? Why do we have to use it? Why can't we just continue to download modules the old way and stick them in? But let's talk about just a very simple PHP project. Forget about Drupal for a minute. Let's say we're going to build a very simple command line project in PHP, and it's got to send email and it's got to read write YAML. We could very easily, well, maybe not very easily, but we could absolutely open up a text editor and start coding. We can go to the PHP documentation page and figure out how to send emails, how to make them pretty with HTML, how to attach a PDF file to it. We could also figure out how to read a YAML file and convert that into a PHP object and vice versa. And that could take some time, and to make it robust and secure and flexible and all that stuff, it's going to be a not insignificant investment in your time, or your company's time for that matter. The other option is, because we're in the Drupal space or in the PHP spaces, there's a lot of open source code out there. So why don't we just go find some of that magic open source code and include that in our project? And that's kind of what this diagram is showing. Let's say, we find a component called SwiftMailer, and that's at version 5.4.12. It does exactly what we need. We download it, we stick it in our in our directory structure somewhere for our project, and we write to its API. Like, we write code that calls classes and methods to the SwiftMailer 5.4.12 API. The good news is it'll work for a time. The bad news is that the maintainers of SwiftMailer don't really care about your schedule. So tomorrow they might release SwiftMailer version 6 with breaking API and breaking API changes. And if you give your project to someone else and tell them that they also need SwiftMailer, and you don't specify which version, they could download a version of SwiftMailer that doesn't actually work with the project. So with very simple dependency trees like this, we at the start, we already have to take care of which versions of which dependencies work with which versions of our project. It gets a little bit worse because something like SwiftMailer can have its own dependencies. And so you have to keep track of, well, SwiftMailer version 5.4.12 works with email validator version 2.0.0. And very quickly, for a project of any size, this can get out of hand. So what we want to be able to do is we want there to be like an automated way to lock a particular version of our project with a particular version of each of our dependencies. And by an automated lock, I'm not talking about writing it down in a wiki or keeping it in a note on the side of your desk. I'm talking about a way that will guarantee that when you're using a particular version of your project, you're using a particular version of each of your dependencies. And it can get even worse, right? Because let's say 3 months ago you had SwiftMailer, and that's got a sub-dependency of this polyfill icon v thing. And then tomorrow you add some other dependency, and that's calling for a newer version of polyfill icon v. Well, if you're really on top of things, then before you install this some other dependency, you'll go through all of its sub-dependencies and make sure there's no conflicts. If you are not on top of things, you're likely to install a second version of polyfill icon v and watch all hell break loose. Uzi, I'm not sure, is that a question for me? I think all sessions are being recorded. That might be a question for Tim or Owen. There we go. Okay, thank you.
Yep, Owen answered it. Thank you. So the question was, where can I watch this afterward? And we are going to try to have these on YouTube. Sorry to interrupt. Mike, go ahead.
Oh, no problem. All right, so let's summarize a little bit. Keeping each dependency's version locked, as well as checking for version conflicts, is challenging / tedious / a job that nobody wants. Assembling a code base that includes dependencies and dependencies of dependencies and dependencies of dependencies of dependencies. Follow that rabbit hole down as deep as you would like. Make sure version numbers are good. There's no conflicts. That just sucks. You know, on the slide, I have it extremely tedious, but really nobody wants to do that, or virtually nobody wants to do that. And as humans, we're not very dependable at that job either. We make terrible dependency managers. And that's really the problem that Composer solves for us. It actually does more than what I've just talked about. We basically tell Composer what we need. We want the latest version of this dependency, for example, and it takes care of the rest. It makes sure that it's not going to conflict with any of our existing dependencies. It makes sure that any of its sub-dependencies is not going to conflict with any of our current dependencies. It downloads it. It puts it in a predictable place in our code base, and it makes it easily accessible within our code via its autoloader. So it does a lot of things for us that we don't realize we need until we have to do them ourselves. And when it comes to Drupal, Drupal core has dozens of direct dependencies. And I don't even know what the number of indirect dependencies are, but it's big. It's a significant number, and it would be near impossible for someone to have to manage all that stuff. So that's why we need Composer. Let's talk about the basics when it comes to Composer. You know, it's all just kind of setting a foundation here, level setting everybody so that when we start talking about the more advanced stuff or the maximizing stuff, hopefully we'll all be on the same page. I know for me that when I first install or start using a command line tool, I like to know how big is the command set. How many Composer blah things are there? So most command line tools have a command that lists all of the possible commands. Composer list is the one for Composer. So we can do Composer list, and I'm going to make my font size a little bit smaller. I'm not asking you to read it. I'm just, just notice that it's a little bit more than one screen. And Composer kind of cheats a little bit because there's actually like 3 different commands that upgrade. There's 3 different commands for clearing cache. So it's actually not as bad as it looks here. And if you've been using Composer, by rote since, for a few years with Drupal, I think you might be surprised at how many of these commands you already know. I also like to know how to get help. So with Composer, it's Composer help followed by the command. So you can do something like Composer help list, how do I use the list function? And it's pretty straightforward. You can actually get, I can pass it a namespace, which is something like that. Drupal command there, but we won't worry about that right now. And then these last 4 are the ones that I think most people who have used Composer or learned Composer just because you're a Drupal person, know. Composer require, which gets you a dependency. Composer update, which updates the dependency. Composer remove, self-explanatory, and Composer install. Yeah, we're going to talk about Composer outdated in a little bit, Tim, for sure. But I think these are probably the first 4, maybe there's a Composer create project in there. The first 4 that most people generally use, and they're fairly easy to understand as long as everything is going well. right? Until things go south. So let's talk about this. You know, the main subject of this talk is the Drupal recommended project template. Before we talk about that, let's, oh, I always forget that I removed a slide from this presentation to keep it a little bit shorter. I was going to talk about the history of the template a little bit, but I think for this presentation, the amount of time we have, I'll just say that this template became part of Drupal core with Drupal 8.8. So prior to Drupal 8.8, there was a different template. Wasn't really an official core community project. It was something that a lot of people used, but it wasn't official. This is, since Drupal 8.8, the de facto best practice template for starting a Drupal project. And everything I'm saying goes for Drupal 8.8 and Drupal 9. So what is this template? Well, it's a starting point, right? It's not something you clone. It's something that gets downloaded. And it's kind of like when you go to the puppy store and get a puppy, right? The minute you walk away from the puppy store, that puppy's yours. And if the puppy poops on the floor, you can't complain to the pet store, right? It's your puppy. So you use this template and it's a starting point, and then you just kind of build your project using this template. It provides a robust starting point. I teach a full day version of Composer for Drupal developers. And one of the things I do is I kind of show, if we didn't have the template, all the things we'd have to do manually in order to get to where the template starts us. And we're going to kind of go through some of those things in a few minutes. So here are kind of the big flagship features of the template. Back in the Drupal 6, Drupal 7 days, when you were to start a Drupal project, you would go to Drupal.org, you'd download Drupal, it would come down in a directory named Drupal, and you would rename that directory to My Project, to Acme, or whatever. And literally, your project directory is the same as your Drupal directory. You would point www.acme.com at that directory. With Drupal 8, and even with Drupal 7 a little bit, some folks started moving the Drupal directory one level down into like what we call a nested document root. And that's the second bullet point here. So now the best way to think about a Drupal 8 and Drupal 9 project moving forward is you have a project directory, and then inside of that, you have your Drupal directory. And it's that inner one. By default, it's called web in this template. But it's that inner one that you point your www.mysite.com to. And this first bullet point talks about how you have your project, and Drupal is just one of many dependencies of your project. So it's kind of a different way of thinking about Drupal, where Drupal's not my project, it's just a dependency of my project. Another thing the template does is it takes care of the scaffolding files. And scaffolding files are defined as any core files that live outside of the core directory. And we're actually going to see a visual of this in a couple minutes, so we'll put that one aside for now. For the fourth bullet point, by default, when you ask Composer to get a new dependency, where does it put it? It puts it in its vendor directory by default. Now that's great most of the time. That's a predictable place. But if you're asking Drupal to get you the redirect module, you don't want the redirect module in your vendor directory. You want the redirect module in your modules/contrib directory. So that's just a little tweak to Composer's behavior that the template allows for. Again, if we didn't have the template and you did, hey, Composer, give me the redirect module, it'd end up in the vendor directory, and then you'd have to do, you'd have to modify that template, or you'd have to modify your project to get it in the right place. The template just gives that to you for free. And the last bullet point is, something, again, I think we take for granted until you kind of start understanding how Composer works. By default, when you ask Composer to get you a dependency, Composer required Drupal/redirect, Composer's only looking in one place, and it's not Drupal.org. It's packagist.org. Packagist.org is kind of the de facto PHP dependency oh my gosh, repository. But Composer is open source, and the authors of Composer have made it so that you can also search other repositories for dependencies. So the Drupal community has its own Drupal Composer repository that includes every single project on Drupal.org. Every contributed module, every contributed theme is available via Composer through Drupal's public project repository. And the template basically provides access to that. Tim's asking, any neat thoughts for advice on converting to Drupal to the new template from an older template? Yeah, I think it's a good idea. But you can't think of it as you're converting templates, right? Because once you start your project, your template is now like your project. So it's not so much that you're switching templates, but you're switching, some of the main dependencies in your template. This is actually, I teach a full day version of this. We actually go through that exercise in the full day. Yeah, Allison has some steps as well. It's not awful to do unless you're coming from a place that's not in good shape. But if your project is generally well organized, it's not, as Allison said, it's normally not that bad. Okay, so we're going to do some demos. I'm going to skip like the very easy ones here. So I've actually I have a site already installed, Drupal recommended project. And I'm going to kind of go through what this template has, and then we'll talk about some other demos. And, we might do somewhere along the way one of these, but I'm hoping that this is all stuff that most everybody has seen. If not, we can always come back. But let's take a look at the template. And so the template lives up on GitHub. It's actually part of core, but it's mirrored here to GitHub as well. And I'd like to kind of give a tour of this template. And this is for the latest version of Drupal core 9.0.6. And I'd like to break templates up into 3 sections generally. The metadata section, the require section, and then everything else, because I don't really have a good name of it. A good name for it. Oh, so there's another question here. Is there anything I want to do to take care of the health of my Composer? Is a command or multiple commands? I want to check to make sure everything's updated before I start to use Composer. So I'm not 100% sure what you're asking, Kristen. We could talk about the Composer validate command. So what Composer validate does, yeah, I don't know if I'd recommend dry run just to check on the health. What Composer validate does is it makes sure that your composer.json file is proper JSON syntax. There's no syntax errors. And also make sure that your composer.lock file is up to date and in sync with your composer.json file. So that's Composer validate. And if you want to know more about Composer validate, so glad you asked. Composer help validate. There you go. So some more information about it. All right, so let me take you through these 3 sections fairly quickly. And I have till quarter after, correct? Is that right, Tim? 45 minutes? I feel like I should know this, but I'm gonna assume I have 45 minutes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I'm gonna go kind of quickly so we can do some demos here. And luckily this is recorded, so you can always play me back at half speed later on. So this first section, actually before the repository section, this is metadata. So this is data about your project. So normally when I create a new project based on this template, the first thing I do is I get in there and I start changing. Like this is the name of the template. I want the name of the project. So it's going to be acme/website. I'm going to give it a reasonable description. Maybe I'll update the license if it's going to be licensed. Maybe it's proprietary. Maybe the project does have a homepage somewhere. Maybe maybe there are support or chat links. Maybe the homepage is actually the project tracker. There's actually an author's key you can add here. So you can list like who is in charge of this project. And that's very helpful 2-3 years from now when someone says, who the heck wrote this? And then they know who to blame. You can go to getcomposer.org and see the other available keys for this metadata section. There's like version and readme and stuff like that. But I tend to I like to take ownership of my project, especially when I first start it. It kind of sets everything off on the right foot. This next section, repositories, this is basically a list of other Composer repositories to check other than packages. So this goes back to that last bullet point. Oops. This last bullet point provides access to Drupal's own public project repository. Well, this is the URL to Drupal's Composer repository. If you just started a Composer project from scratch and you wanted it to be a Drupal project, you would have to know that you need to add this section. The template just gives it to you. The require section and the require dev section, which the template does not have, these are generally the meat of your composer.json file. And these list your dependencies. So dependencies generally are one of 3 things. They are either a Composer plugin, which these first 3 things are plugins. A Composer plugin is like a Drupal module. A Drupal module extends the functionality of Drupal. A Composer plugin extends the functionality of Composer. So we'll come back to those. Another thing that a dependency can be is a meta package. Drupal core recommended is indeed a meta package. And a meta package is just a bucket of other dependencies. So it doesn't have any code of its own. It's basically just like a collection of other dependencies. And then the third thing that a dependency can be is a library. And you might hear, library, package, class, dependency. There's probably 3 or 4 other nouns that these things are called. But when we start adding like Drupal/redirect, that's a library according to Composer, even though it's a module as far as Drupal's concerned. So the template basically comes with 3 plugins, which we're going to talk about each of these in a moment, as well as this meta package, which we're going to dive back into in a moment. Then we have some other stuff down here. I'm not going to go through it all in detail, but if there's any dependencies that cannot be added, they're listed in the conflict section. This stuff basically helps determine by default when a dependency is requested, are you going to get a stable version? If there's a beta that's newer than the stable, are you going to get the beta? So this kind of sets the order of precedence of what your dependencies can be. This config, think of this as like the preferences pane for Composer. There's no UI for Composer. We have to be able to set preferences somewhere. All this silly little sort packages thing does is whenever you add a new dependency, it puts it in the list alphabetically. That's kind of nice. Then we have the extra section. So the extra section is where a lot of the magic happens. The extra section is where data can be added that's specific to the project that can then be used by the plugins. So this first one is the Drupal Scaffold data. This goes along with the core Composer Scaffold plugin. So core Composer Scaffold is the thing that takes care of all of those scaffold files outside of Drupal core. And all this configuration does is basically says, hey, when you are handling scaffolding files, just so you know, Drupal lives in the web directory. Some folks like to call the nested doc root maybe the doc root directory or public HTML or some www. But this basically defines what is the web root of the project. Composer Installers is another plugin. And this is the magic plugin that basically says, hey, if you're a Drupal module, you're not going in the vendor directory. You're going in the web/module/contrib directory. So what happens is the Drupal Composer repository, this thing up here, basically exposes every single module on Drupal.org to Composer, and it lists it giving a type of Drupal module. If you look in the composer.json file of any Drupal module, you will see it has type of Drupal module. The reason for that is so that when somebody adds that to their project, it ends up in the right directory. Otherwise, it would end up in the vendor directory. And you can see there's even like type Drupal core. This is how, Composer knows to put Drupal core inside the web/core directory. The third plugin, this core project message plugin, this is kind of a fun little one. It's normally the first one I remove as well. All this does is after the create project command is done. So this is like a Drupal hook almost, post create project. So after Composer create project is run, it puts this data, it puts this message on the screen for you. So really, once you create your project, from the minute you use the template, you really don't need this anymore. And this is normally the first thing I just do a Composer remove Drupal core project message and get rid of it. Okay, so one more thing to show you with the template. Let's talk about this core recommended, because there's some magic that happens in here as well. So this is a dependency of type meta package. So we could search for this and we would find it on Drupal. I'm going to do it here. Core recommended, and we would find it on GitHub as well. And we can go to the latest version, and you'll see that this is the entire dependency. It's one file. It's a composer.json file. If we take a look at that, you'll see it is indeed a meta package. And again, a meta package is just a list of dependencies. And here's a list of dependencies. So basically what this is Drupal core plus all of the dependencies for Drupal core. Now, what's interesting about this is specific to a released version of Drupal, 9.0.6. There's another one for 9.0.5, 4, 3. Every single release has a composer.json file meta package. The reason is because with every release of Drupal core, all of the automated tests that are in core have to pass. And all of those tests are run with a particular set of dependencies. So this meta package basically guarantees that if you're using Drupal core 9.0.6, you're using the exact version, there's no wiggle room here, the exact version of each core dependency that has passed every single test. So this guarantees you're getting a stable green test passing version of Drupal core. And this is something that the old template did not provide out of the box, which was a bit of a bummer. But so this is, for me, this was one of the really nice things to see in the new core template, was it fixed this kind of ongoing issue of having what we called floating dependencies in the old template. This kind of
Can I ask a question, Michael?
Yeah.
So with those versions on the dependencies locked like that, it seems like when you go to update Drupal core recommended, you just have to do composer update. Otherwise, I think I've run into the issue that where, like, if you just do update specifically, like composer update, and then do Drupal core recommended, like some of the dependencies, because it doesn't want to update them, maybe they're like, also there's another module that requires them to be locked at a lower level.
It could be. I mean, the proper way to update core with the new template is to update this meta package. So you should be able to do a composer update Drupal core recommended with dependencies. That should work.
What you're saying, that with dependencies on
sometimes there, it may not work if there's another dependency that also has one of these locked. In that case, you actually have to look to the other dependency and see if there's an update for that. Because what that's basically saying is that that other dependency is not going to work with anything higher than Drupal core 9.0.6. So I know it feels like I'm passing the buck from Drupal core to the other dependency, but I kind of am.
Gotcha.
It's not dependent. So I think Tim's like screaming at me, dependency hell, but Tim, weren't you the one? Yeah. So Composer outdated is really the way to get out of, actually, no, not Composer outdated, Composer why not, which is what we're going to talk about. Yes. Thank you, Allison. Yeah. We're going to talk about Composer why not if we have time. Although we're at 14 minutes, good golly. All right. I'm gonna have to like double how fast I'm talking. And I'm sorry to the, there's a captioner in here, right? Oh, I'm so sorry. Captioner person. Okay, best practice documentation for navigating Composer. I don't know if there is best practice documentation. So, I'm going to mention this once. And so I normally mention it at the end, but I'll mention it now. And I've mentioned it a couple times. I teach a long form version of this class. I'm giving it at Badcamp. I think it's very low cost at Badcamp. I don't know exactly how much it is, but I think it's like, if someone knows, like less than $20 maybe. As part of that, you'll get access to this document. And this is kind of, I'm not sure what I use this to teach. It's like a 60-page Composer. Oh, it's $50. Thank you very much, Kristen. And you'll get this as part of that. And this, I keep this really up to date. And this is kind of like for me and my students, the best practice guide. And it covers a lot of stuff, obviously, that we're not covering in 45 minutes here. All right, so not Tim, Uzi, right? You just asked me that question. So hopefully I answered your question somewhere along there.
Yuri, yeah.
Yuri.
So.
Oh, Yuri, I'm sorry. Good
No
guy.
problem.
How old am I? Because I need another font size increase on my monitor. I have a client named Uzi, which is why I saw the U and the I and immediately went to Uzi. So, all right, so should we jump forward to some of the more interesting examples in the last 15 minutes? Hopefully I've paved enough concrete to give everyone somewhat of a good foundation. So let me tell you what the examples are and the ones I'm willing to do. And then, maybe you can just, if you have strong feelings, put something in the chat. So we can talk about navigating PHP versions. I run into this a lot with clients, and when I teach Composer to private organizations as well, the importance of everybody having the same version of PHP on their local and the remote environments, and what can go wrong if you don't, and actually even how to get around that. So there's that discussion we can have. I really like this example. This is probably one of my favorites. This is something I think once you see it, most people end up using. If you write custom modules, it might behoove you to, rather than committing them to your project repository, commit them individually to, a private GitHub repository, for example. And then this is a very quick demo because it's actually really silly, stupid, easy to do. You can actually use Composer to require custom modules from a private GitHub repository. So that's a good example as well, I think. We could talk about Composer outdated, as well as Composer why not, Composer depends. Someone already prompted me to talk about Composer validate. Was that Kristen? So, and Allison, yeah, that was an example of a private repo. Yep. Let's see, we can talk about requiring alpha, beta release candidates in dev. I'd rather not do the applying patches one, and I have good reasons for that. I'll tell you at the end. And we can talk about like Drush and Drupal console as well, their relationship with Composer. So any strong feelings one way or the other? No?
On what?
On which example you'd like to see. Otherwise, I'm just going to choose one.
Just do it.
Yeah, go for it.
All right. So I'm just going to make sure everything's working here because yeah, okay. So I'm just doing a quick require. Wow, that was fast, wasn't it? Fantastic. Okay, so let's do this one because it's my favorite and it usually prompts questions, and then we'll save some time. We'll do the private repo one, and then we'll do the why not stuff. Yeah, Stephen, I will, I'll address that as well. Okay, so I have got, it's almost like I was hoping to do this one. I've got a private repo up on GitHub. It's marked as private, and it's a silly little repo. It basically has a README and a composer.json. But you can imagine it's like a big old custom Drupal module. We can just play pretend. And so if it exists, it's not on packages. The only place it exists is up here on GitHub as a private repo. So I can come over here and I can say, hey, Composer, and here, let me clear this out a little bit. Clear Composer require ultimike / private repo. And Composer is going to be like, I don't know what you're talking about. I've never heard of that dependency, so I can't help you with it. And that makes sense because it's not on packages. It's not on Drupal.org. So why would Composer know about it? So what we can do is we can actually tell Composer about it by adding it as a new repository. So we got this little bit of code, and it's actually really simple code, pico composer.json. We can come down here to our repository section. We can add it in to our repository section, and I'll talk about it as soon as I fix all my indentation. You see type is VCS. So there's a couple different types of repositories. If it's a full-blown Composer repository and it's actually running certain software that exposes things, that software is obviously open source, then it'd be type Composer. But you can also have a VCS, version control system type. And that's basically, you use VCS if you're pointing at a specific repository, maybe on GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, maybe your private GitLab, something like that. And then you just give it the URL to that repository. And this is nothing more than, this thing right here. So it's the same as the SSH path. It's the same as the clone URL, same thing. So we add that as the repository. So we say that, and I've gotten in the habit of anytime I make a manual change to my composer.json, I validate. Just because I want to make sure that my syntax is valid. My lock file is not up to date. That's a whole other thing. We're not going to talk about that right now, so I finish on time. So let's try it again. Composer require ultimike private repo. This time we're going to get closer. They said, well, it knows about it, but it couldn't fetch it because I need a token. And hey, look at this. Here's a URL to get said token. Because of course we need to authenticate. It's a private repo. So I can come over here and it's going to force me to enter my password again, which, all right, I'm done with that. Look how long that password is, so secure. And I can basically get a new token that allows Composer to authenticate against my account to get access to this repository. So there you go. Everybody copy that down and steal my token if you want. You can have my private repo. Where am I? So I got the token. It will be stored. It tells you where it's going to put it. And then I have to enter it here. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit paste. You can't see it, but it's there. And then boom. I have it. There's the private repo right there. So this is just a super easy way to, most people are used to like writing custom modules and committing them to their project. And you can still do that. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you're writing a custom module that might be used among multiple projects, I would argue this is a much better way to go. I've showed you the absolute simplest way to authenticate. Obviously the authentication token is stored in my home directory here. But you can do other things with this, with GitLab, with Bitbucket, to authenticate so that you can actually store that authentication token. I don't know if I'd store it in the repository, but you can make sure that all of your development team has the token and things like that. But that's
a question, Michael, on that. So how does Composer know which repository to find, the said package? Does it just check like every repository from top to bottom until it finds the dependency?
I don't know what the order is. I've wondered that as well. I suspect that it basically starts with And again, if someone else knows the answer, I am more than willing to I don't know what the right word is, but to accept it. I suspect that Composer searches these repositories first. And if it doesn't find it in there, then it searches packages.org. That's my suspicion.
Gotcha. It was just, I noticed that we don't really have to specify in the requirements, you know, the dependencies, like which repository to find it. So it's doing it automatically somehow. So that's what.
Oh, okay. Well, here. So maybe I'm assuming knowledge here. Where am I? Packages.org. I just switched to Firefox. So now I have to make sure I spell everything right because I don't have all of my, is it packages? There we go. So this is the default location. It's the main Composer repository. So there's code is not stored here. So if we look at Drupal/core recommended, and we come here, this is basically just like the yellow pages, but Packages knows where the code is stored. So when you do it, so if you don't have any repositories listed, when you do a Composer require, what's actually happening is Composer's calling up Packages and saying, do you know about this package? If Packages knows about it, basically Packages just sends Composer along to GitHub in this case. But this could be just as easily stored on Bitbucket, on GitLab, or on any other public repository. Am I answering your question now?
I think so. I'll ask more questions in Slack after we're done.
Okay.
That's okay.
Yeah, sure. Okay, 3 minutes. Oh boy. All right. Well, let's do this. Let's talk about, Let's talk about this. Let's say we are aware if we do Composer outdated. Let's just do a Composer outdated. All right. And so what Composer outdated is, this is a lot like the available updates page for Drupal. Only this is the available updates for all of your Composer dependencies. So normally, I would normally do a Composer outdated -- direct, which only gets direct dependencies I specifically asked for. Composer outdated on its own gets all dependencies. So let's just take this twig example down here. So we're at 2.12.5 right now. But notice that there is a 3.0.5 version. So if we didn't know better, we could say, hey, you know what? Composer update twig for me. I want the latest and greatest twig. And Composer is going to try and do that, but it's not going to give me any updates, and it's not going to give me a whole lot of help. It's basically saying, hey, there's nothing to install, update, or remove. Now, if you're like me, when you first started using Composer, you were like, oh, what the heck? I can see right here that there's an update. And I can see right here that I'm asking you to update that. And I can see right here that you are not listening to me. So this is where the Composer why not command comes in. Composer why not, which is actually an alias for Composer prohibits, but why not is a much nicer way of saying it, I think. Composer why not answers the question, why won't you update? So why won't twig update? And it basically shows us things that have twig listed as dependencies. So this thing requires twig at this version constraint. So basically something above 1.4.1 or something above 2.12. Drupal core requires something above 2.12. But core recommended requires this exact version. So therefore, we cannot update twig because that would break this rule. So basically, the only way to update twig would be to update this thing right here. So Allison, pinning package, I'm not sure what you're referring to there. Let's see. Include the version you want to update to when you're using why not? Oh gosh, everyone's typing. Let's see. Yeah, sometimes I do that. Sometimes I will, you can do composer, why not, twig, colon, followed by the version you want to update to. That's fine. Composer outdated Drupal. So yeah, Tim, I am not a big fan of composer outdated. So you can do stuff like this, which will show you basically all of the Drupal-y dependencies, like all of your modules. I actually prefer the direct. So when you do composer outdated -direct, and this is not going to return to anything since this project's so new, this is going to give you Drupal modules, Drupal themes, but as well as things like Drush and other dependencies that you've added, like composer installers for that matter, or composer patches. So I actually prefer outdated direct. What you're doing is not invalid by any stretch, but I actually prefer this. Direct requirements. So yeah, so maybe I didn't define that clear enough. A direct, yes, so Allison, you nailed it. A direct requirement is something you specifically asked for, right? When I asked for, I did it real quick up here. When I asked for path auto, that's a direct dependency. But when I asked for path auto, I also got token and ctools. So those are indirect dependencies. Those are dependencies of dependencies. So when you do composer outdated direct, it's only really looking at path auto. It's not looking for updates for this, which could be a downside, but.
Hey, Mike, can we get Steve Longo's question? He's asked twice now here.
Yes.
Before we end.
I was going to wait
till the last one.
Yeah, I was going to wait till they asked the third time.
Also, speeding up Composer and how to deal with timeouts. It's just any advice for.
Yeah, here's the advice. Stephen, be patient for a couple more months because I'm sorry, my wife just walked in. I think the dog is on the couch, so she's yelling at the dog. So I'm actually using Composer 2 for this demo. Composer 2 works, well, it's a release candidate, so it's not out yet. It works with most Drupal-y things. The one glaring example right now is Composer patches, which a lot of folks use, is not working with Composer 2 yet. But I can tell you the speed is way up and the memory usage is way down for Composer 2. That was really one of the focuses of Composer 2 was performance. So I don't really have a whole lot of tips, especially on the memory usage standpoint for you with Composer 1. It just kind of is what it is. But Composer 2, from what I've seen, yeah, and Yuri's right with Composer memory limit equals -1. But even then, if you don't have enough memory on your machine or in the container, you could still hit potential issues there. I don't use Protissimo. So I actually have a blog post out there, Drupal Easy. See if I can find it real quick. Drupal Easy, Composer plugins. There we go. I'll throw this in the chat. Yeah, so Prestissimo is one, and there's another one. I always forget the name of it. Yeah, this Composer Drupal optimization is one. There are things that speed up Composer. Prestissimo enables parallel downloads. I tend to not use any of them. I don't think they do. I mean, they help a little bit. For me, they never really helped enough to make it worth the while. Yeah, and Tim just put the link up to that one as well. So I appreciate that. Yeah, and Allison, you're right. I believe the Pantheon